I don't recall that I have ever seen or myself or said or heard anybody say, when you see a caterpillar, or when you see a butterfly, that is. When you see a butterfly, I don't recall that I've ever said, I don't recall ever hearing anybody say, a beautiful butterfly flying by and say, hey, there is a flying caterpillar. Now, someone may have said it to be funny, like I just did. You know, you go to Callaway Gardens. My family and I enjoy. It's been a while since we've been there, but through the years we've gone there many times. And several times when we've been there, we've stopped by that flying caterpillar exhibit, right? No, wait. I think it's called a butterfly exhibit. How many of you have been in that? Yeah, there's butterflies flying all beautiful, beautiful butterflies. See, caterpillars become butterflies through a metamorphosis, a transformation that takes place. A caterpillar doesn't have someone come along and tape some wings to its back and become a butterfly. It just won't work. A caterpillar becomes a butterfly from the inside out. It's a transformation that takes place. No one that I know of mistakes a butterfly as a caterpillar. It was a caterpillar. It is a butterfly. Two very different things, but one made out of the other. One of the great fallacies of Christianity is that following Christ means adding on a set of beliefs and doctrines to the life I already have. One of the reasons I think some folks that get started well in Christianity fall away is because either they perceive or are being taught that Christianity is just simply a set of beliefs that we follow. Don't get me wrong. As Christians, we have a body of beliefs that make up our doctrinal principles and guidelines. But the fact is, Christianity is not me adding on a set of Christian beliefs to my life. Christianity is me having been a caterpillar being transformed into a butterfly. Christianity is me being transformed, not just changed. Christianity is not just me adding something on. It is something happening inside of me and changing me from the inside out. Listen, folks, God's grace transforms and changes every part of our lives and our calling. That is the reality of Christianity. It is unique to any other faith on earth. Every other religion on earth is a set of beliefs people are to follow. Christianity is something that happens on the inside of us. And God transforms us from the inside out so that ultimately it reflects on our outside behavior, but Christianity does not start with our behavior. It starts on the inside, and we are transformed. In the book of Galatians that we're continuing to study, this morning we pick up with a passage that's going to take us 2 weeks today and next week called The Grace Transformation. That's what I'm titling it, The Grace Transformation. If you have your Bibles with you, you can turn now to the book of Galatians if you've not already. Galatians chapter 1, we'll pick up in verse 11. The book of Galatians began as a letter that Paul wrote to a circuit of churches in a region known as Galatia that falls just east of Asia Minor, Ephesus, and those areas. The Galatian churches were a group of churches Paul helped start on his very first missionary journey. They were near and dear to his heart. And he had begun those churches with the gospel of Jesus Christ that says if you repent and turn to Christ, Christ will come in and change you. It is nothing that you do. There's nothing that you can do. Unfortunately, a group of people had slipped in behind Paul and had, number one, began to shed doubt on the authority of Paul to even preach the gospel. They were undermining his apostleship. And number two, they were beginning to perpetrate and perpetuate the idea that Christianity was something that, first of all, you had to follow a set of ceremonies and then become a Christian. That is, you had to become Jewish and buy into their ceremonies and their guidelines before you could actually become Christian. They were saying, the Judaizers were saying, look, we believe that it is Jesus Christ that saves us. We believe it's His grace that saves us. But we think first you have to follow a set of rules in order to receive that grace, which Paul says is no gospel at all. In fact, last week we learned if you change the gospel a little bit, it doesn't become a changed gospel, it becomes no gospel at all. Paul says if you change it a little bit, if you add even a little bit of work to it, if you get the idea that your conversion or your growth, your spiritual growth, your sanctification, one day your glorification, if you get the idea that any of that is about your work, you've just added to the gospel. And in fact, you've made it something else. It's no gospel at all. You got to understand something. Paul was one of the great Jewish leaders of his time. We're going to learn more about that in his testimony. And for Paul to say this, he probably had to come farther than anybody at that time from believing in his Jewish thought and life and belief. And not only was he a devout Jew, he was a leader of devout Jews. And not only was he a leader of the devout Jews, he was a leader of the leaders. And it so transformed him, so changed him, that now he was appalled that anyone would want to go back. So picking up in Galatians chapter 1, this entire passage will go all the way through chapter 2, verse 14. Today we will probably get somewhere up to around verse 24. But essentially what we're about to read is Paul sharing his testimony. His testimony from when he came to Christ, became an apostle, and even his testimony that includes a confrontation with one of the guys that would have been seen as the more important apostles. And it was an apostle long before Paul. And so all of this is kind of part of his story. And in his story, what we'll see is a grace transformation that took place. And here's what I want us to learn. I want us to take a look at some of the transformations, plural. Some of the transformations that take place when you're born again. Some of the things that change in your life when you become born again. Not things that should change, not things that might change. I'm telling you, if you're truly born again, these are things that change. Now, maybe they change a little over time. Maybe some of them, you'll see some of these and you'll say, that thing changed radically in my life when I got saved. But this other thing, it hasn't changed quite as quickly. And still the other thing has changed a little bit, but it's just kind of an average process. It depends on who we are as to how quickly and how differently things change. But change they will. Because when you are transformed from the inside out, ultimately it affects every part of your life. The grace transformation, we'll begin reading in chapter 1, verse 11, and we will read as we study. Verse 11, "But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man." Now he says, I make known. That word know there are three Greek words used for know in the New Testament. This particular one infers a certification. I am certifying. That is, not only did I say it before, but I am certifying now, brethren. He's speaking to the believers. But when he uses the term brethren, generally speaking, he's talking to Christians, men and women, Christians, the group of believers. I'm speaking to you, Christians, and I'm certifying something. Hear me now. You listening? He says, I am certifying that the gospel that I preached to you. Remember, Paul was the one who first started these churches. I got to tell you, there's something about when God uses you to plant or start something and get that thing going. And then maybe He calls you to another area to see someone coming behind you and on purpose destroy it. And that's what the folks were doing that had followed Paul. We oftentimes refer to them as the Judaizers. You're going to hear me use that term Judaizer all throughout this series. Let me just make sure. I don't know if I've clearly defined that. I may have. It's been a few weeks ago. But when I use the term Judaizers, I'm referring to a group of people that came in behind Paul, not just in Galatia, but some other churches too, who were trying to teach that you first had to become Jewish before you could become a Christian. That is, you had to be circumcised, you had to follow Jewish custom, then you could become a Christian. And by the way, that was some debate in that early church. In fact, Acts 15 talks about a conference that was held in the church in Jerusalem, where they got together, Paul and Peter and James and the leadership, and said, okay, what are we going to do about these Gentiles who are getting saved? Because up to that point, all your Christians had pretty much been Jewish. And now things are changing. It's funny, when the church was early on, right? And as long as it was all the Jewish people getting saved, there's not a whole lot of problem. But once Gentiles started getting saved, boy, they were wrestling with how to handle that. It's never been a whole lot different. When change comes to a church, it's hard, right? And when things start changing, and that was the first church. They didn't even have much history or much tradition. And still, when Gentiles started getting saved, they started looking around and going, whoa, wait just a second. It was one thing for all the Jewish folk to get saved, but now the Gentiles are getting saved. We better make sure they become Jewish before they become Gentiles. So they got together in Jerusalem in Acts 15 and debated this thing and came out of it and said, no. So funny, James says, fact is, we're asking them to do things our fathers didn't even do. Please. And so, no, you don't have to become Jewish before you become a Christian. You just you believe upon Jesus Christ by grace through faith based upon Christ. If you're Jewish, then keep on being Jewish if you get saved. That's fine. You don't have to change. If you're Gentile, keep on being that. But when you turn to Christ, He changes you, plus or minus nothing added from you. It's not about your works or your behavior or your activities. And so that's what they had decided. And so here's Paul coming back in verse 11 and saying, brothers, do you remember that's the gospel I preached when I came to you originally? And let's make no mistake about it. That's not a gospel that men gave me. Let me just be very clear. I'm not stuttering. Paul is refuting the accusation by the Judaizers that Paul was a guy who had received a gospel or that preached a gospel to please people. He was a people pleaser. And all he wanted to do, he wanted to kind of go, he would check the polls every day, the opinion polls, and he would kind of go that direction. And he would preach whatever impressed people. And that's what the Judaizers were saying. This gospel he preached, it doesn't require any works. The Judaizers were saying, are you kidding me? He's preaching something easy so he'll get a lot of followers. That sounds good, doesn't it? Paul, he's telling you all you don't have to do anything. You don't have to follow any circumcision, any ceremonies, any works. You know why he's doing that? He's doing it because he wants people to follow him. He's trying to gain a lot of recognition. He wants notoriety. Paul said, really? Let me tell you something. The gospel I preached, I didn't even receive it from man. Let me tell you something, folks. Every religion on earth that comes from man is works-based. Islam. It is essentially a works-based faith. Go to just about any religion that you can find on earth that's not Christianity, and it's works-based. It is, here are the things to do, here are the pillars to follow, here are the steps to follow, here are the... Those who are Buddhist, it's a system of works. Those who are Hindu, it's a system of works. Man-made religion is always going to tell us the things we should do to achieve something. And God comes along and says, you need to understand something. Sin has so wrecked you, there's nothing you can do. Sin has so violated you. Sin has so corrupted you, there's nothing you can do. All you need is surrender. If there's, I guess you want to say that's doing something, you surrender. And it's what I've done for you. And Paul said that was not something men gave me. Verse 12. He said, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it. But it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. You may remember Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. It was radical. He was on his way to go kill some more Christians, to go kill and imprison some more Gentiles, Christians. And he was struck blind, and he went for several days and spent time in the house of a man that he was sent to. And it was during those times and right after that he began to receive the gospel. Verse 13, he said, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it." He said, I was all about destroying the church. I was all about destroying the way. That was my job. That was my goal. That was my passion. Paul said, I wanted to destroy Christians because they were Christians. I wanted to kill them. I wanted to hurt them. And every time I saw them, it was my duty and my calling, I thought. And I thought, listen, he would say, I thought I was doing it for God. I thought I was hurting, killing, imprisoning people for God. Paul was a terrorist. I mean, under anybody's definition of terrorist today, those under the guise of religion who kill and maim and attack, we could say they're extremists. Whatever they are, they're doing it under the guise of religion. They're terrorists. Paul was. You think that's a new concept? And then he says in verse 14, "And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation." Even the guys I grew up with, I was moving ahead of them in the hierarchy of the leadership of Judaism. All my friends, I was kind of the 5-star draft pick. You know, I was kind of the 5-star recruit. Everybody else was doing okay, but man, I was way out in front of them. That was me, Paul said. Being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. That was me. I went after it. I moved after it. I got after it. That was me. That was my goal. God had a different plan, didn't he? God saved Paul. And a man whose goal was to kill Christians now converts people to Christianity. A man whose goal was to hate particularly Gentiles and Christians and the whole lot, now his calling would be to preach to them. Listen, Paul's goals in life were transformed. Folks, you listen to me. When you come to Christ, one of the things God will transform is your goals. I remember a guy I knew in high school. He had some friends who were a year or two older than him. And he wasn't saved, but he was a guy that attended church sporadically, kind of that deal. And his friends who were a year or two older than him, he had 2 or 3 friends who actually, as seniors in high school, were Christians. And they actually witnessed to this guy, but their senior year in high school, as they were graduating, they determined that they wanted to go to Bible college and get involved in ministry. And in fact, all those 3 guys are still in ministry even today. And this guy, I remember him saying, I can't imagine anything that I would want to do less than ministry. I can't possibly imagine why that would appeal to someone. That's what the guy said. A couple of years later, he graduated high school, turned to Christ. And 2 years later, he began to head off to college and committed himself to ministry. It was a radical change in his goals. His goals that he thought were one thing changed and radically became something else. Oh, by the way, that was me. I was that guy. I remember my sophomore year in high school and these friends I had, and there were 3 of them going off into ministry. And I literally remember in my mind going, I cannot think of anything that I would want to do less than preaching or ministry or anything related to it. It just has no appeal to me. Even today, I can remember today like it was yesterday thinking that. And 2 years later, I got saved. And within 2 weeks, I knew. It was such a radical transformation of my goals. It all changed. Grace will transform our goals. Now listen, when you first get born again, you have a long way to go to begin to grow and to get victory over certain sin and victory over certain stumbling blocks. Okay, I got that. But one of the things that will probably transform pretty quickly is your goals in life. Now, if your goal was to study to become a nurse or a teacher or a doctor, that might not ever change. God may still want that for you, but your goal and why you're doing it changes. Maybe your purpose in life was to go down some career track, and you're going down that career track because it was all about the money, and you get saved, and God still says, I still want you in that career track, but I want you there because it's going to more glorify me now than just the money. It changes our goals. It changes what we look ahead and say, this is why I'm doing this. Look at verse 15. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through His grace. Verse 15, there's a lot packed into that verse. He said, now before I was even born, God had set me apart for this preaching ministry. But at the point where it pleased Him was where I actually got converted. And again, Paul emphasizing this idea. My salvation was not about me. My salvation was not because I wised up, so to speak. My salvation was not because I all of a sudden stopped being dumb and started being smart. My salvation was because God came into my life. Now, He had called me before I was born, but there was a chronological point where He brought me into the kingdom. And then verse 16, Paul says, to reveal His Son in me. That is, He saved me, not just for me. Listen to me, folks. God didn't save you just for you. Now, no doubt, we are great beneficiaries of our own salvation, but the fact is, God saves us that He might reveal Himself to others through us. My salvation was about a whole lot more than just me. It was about God having an opportunity to reveal Himself through me. That's why God has Christians in every corner of the culture, and every corner of professional life, and every place, in every geographical area. Because in every area, He now has someone there through whom He can reveal His Son. That's why he doesn't call that many people to do what I'm doing, to preach or to pastor or to be missionaries. And make no mistake about it, you are not somehow less a Christian if you're not called to preach. If you're, no way. God takes His people and converts them and puts them all over. He puts them in Robins Air Force Base, and He puts them in the school system, and He puts them in doctor's offices, and He puts them in dentist office, and construction crews, and athletic teams, and He puts them all over the place, and He places them so that through us, He might show His Son. In every geographical area. And so Paul says in verse 15, or verse 16, he was meant to reveal His Son in me, that, watch this, that I might preach Him, blows my mind, that I might preach Him among the Gentiles. It's like Osama bin Laden becomes a Baptist preacher. And I'm not kidding. That's how radical Paul's conversion was. That's how far away he was and how far he came. We're talking about an enormous change in a man. Now, I know we weren't alive back then, and we read black ink on a page, and sometimes we don't fully appreciate how radical this change was. It's enormous. That I might preach Him among the Gentiles. Not only did God change Paul, but He was going to send him to the very people to preach to them, the people He hated the most. It's like a Nazi officer converted going to preach to a Jewish nation. I mean, it's such a radical change. Paul, and the fact is, if you read Paul's ministry, you'll find that never again did he ever have anything against Gentiles. Never again did he ever have anything against Christians. Far from it. He preached to them. He loved them. He gave his life for them. Just a little aside here. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but this business that someone gets saved, and maybe you've grown up in a very racist, bigoted experience in life. Okay, it's how you grew up. It is what it is. But this idea that someone gets saved and a person continues to harbor some of those ideas, And for someone just to say, well, it's just how he was raised. Garbage. You look at the Apostle Paul, the people he hated the most, the people he had grown up being taught. You don't like these people, you despise these people. These people are less than you because of who they are. And these Christians, that's even worse. And now he's going to preach to Gentiles to convert them to Christ, never again to have these ideas about them simply because of who they were. Watch this. Not only do our goals change when we're transformed, but our directives change. The things God points us to, the things God sends us to, the people to whom God sends us. It's a magnificent idea. I want to pause just for a moment. Well, we'll go back. We'll go there in just a minute. Hold on. We'll go back there. I was going to take you to the book of Acts. We'll go there in just a minute. Look at verse 17. Paul says, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. That's actually verse 16. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. He's just re-emphasizing this, that when I got saved, I didn't immediately go to people to get what I should be preaching. It was what God told me. Now listen, Paul is doing two things. He's emphasizing the idea that the gospel he preaches is straight from God. And he's emphasizing the idea that the gospel he preaches is all of God. It's not just from God to him, but it's all of God. It's nothing of man. It's not about the works we do, and it's not given to him as if he took this idea from someone and just used it. Verse 17. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem. But in this case, when Paul says, nor did I go to Jerusalem, at that point, the international headquarters for the church was in Jerusalem. And so it would make sense. If you get born again, if you're called to ministry, if you're called to preach, you might go to the international headquarters to get your training, right? Paul says, I didn't go there. I didn't even go to Jerusalem to get my idea of what I'm supposed to be doing. I did not go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. The other place that Paul might go once he received the gospel, once he received his marching orders. Much like if someone here comes forward and says, Pastor Johnny, I believe God's calling me into some type of ministry, some type of preaching ministry. Can you help me? Well, one of the things I might do is help them to find a school or a place where they can begin to get training. Maybe it's the Bible Institute we do right here at Green Acres Baptist Church. Maybe it's off to a Bible college. Maybe it's off to a seminary. Maybe it's just in a discipleship relationship to begin with. We're going to find someone you can connect with and begin to get trained and develop, right? And that's mostly what you should do. But Paul says, I didn't really do any of that. I didn't go to Jerusalem. I didn't go to the apostles. I went out to Arabia. What's Arabia? Sand. Sand. A desert. Not much. I went out to Arabia. And we're going to see here in just a few moments that it was a 3-year span of time. He went to Arabia, and then he returned again to Damascus. So at no point did he go to where all the church folks were to be taught. He's emphasizing this idea. God changed me straight, and the gospel he gave me was straight from him. Look at verse 18. Then after 3 years, Paul says, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter. So somehow we believe that Paul went into Arabia and probably he encountered the resurrected Christ. You know, to be an apostle, you had to have known Christ from the beginning, from his baptism all the way through. By the way, there is very good reason to think that the Apostle Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. They were the same age. They were in Jerusalem at the same times. I'm sure they crossed paths. And so here Paul says, I got saved, I got my marching orders, I went to Arabia, and I spent 3 years there. Well, what'd you spend 3 years there doing, Paul? Were you preaching? No, he was getting prepared. How many of you know that sometimes to move forward, you got to step back and wait? Sometimes it's absolutely necessary. And this is one of the challenges sometimes about college. People are going, I'm ready to get out of college, start my life, go to work, but it's necessary. Sometimes it's necessary to step aside, get the training. And if you go running out before you finish the training, you're going to run out half-cocked and you're not going to be very effective. Sometimes you're more effective by waiting longer and then going out rather than running out sooner. So there are these time periods, and that was a time period for Paul. So, some people have joked, most seminary degrees, the master's degrees are 3-year degrees, and some people have joked they're 3-year degrees because that's how long Paul spent in the desert, and some of them compare it to that, but that's another story. But anyway, so Paul goes into the desert for 3 years. He gets training straight from Jesus Christ, we believe. And then he goes to Jerusalem, finally. Jerusalem, the international headquarters for the church. He goes to Jerusalem. And then he remained there, and he went to see Peter, by the way. We're going to hear from Peter again, probably next week. And I remained with him 15 days. For a couple of weeks now, Paul stays with Peter. But he's the only one I saw. Verse 19, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So he went to Jerusalem. He saw two guys, Peter and James. Verse 20. Now concerning these things which I write to you, indeed before God, I do not lie. Hey guys, he said, listen, you can check me out, but I'm telling you, what I'm telling you is true. You can check with some of these other apostles. If you want to compare notes, that's fine. Verse 21. Afterward, I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea. The churches of Judea would be right there where Jerusalem is, which were in Christ. These verses 21 and 22, we tend to believe he's probably referring to his first missionary journey. Because at this point, if you go back to the book of Acts and you look at Paul's progression, it would appear that the timing of verses 21 and 22 would fit with Paul's first missionary journey. So Paul says, listen, I met with a couple of the apostles, Peter for 15 days, and I also saw James too. But other than that, this gospel I received came straight from Christ. And then I went off into the mission. In fact, Paul said, I went to my first missionary journey without ever having really gotten to know the churches in Judea around Jerusalem. Verse 23. But here's what the churches in Judea were hearing at that point. They didn't know me by face. They wouldn't know me if they saw me, but here's what they were hearing. Verse 23. He who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith which he once tried to destroy. Hear that? And every once in a while you hear about some person getting saved. That's maybe a celebrity or somebody you know. It's like, wow, so-and-so says they've been saved. They've been born again. My response is generally, we'll see. I'm not cynical. I just know that being converted is a true change. If there's a true change, their lifestyles will change, right? That what they say, where they go, how they act, how they behave will change. I think of an actor like Kirk Cameron. Many of you are familiar with him. Years ago, Growing Pains, he was on that show, and he talks about being an atheist. I'm telling you, when he got converted, okay, as well as I can know about anyone else who I don't really know that well, he looked saved to me. That guy's whole life changed. And not that I'm saying to prove you've been saved, you've got to become a preacher, but I'm just saying things will change in your life. And so you can imagine these folks who were hearing these reports, that Apostle Paul, wait, wasn't he the guy that was in Jerusalem trying to kill Christians, trying to put Christians in jail? Let me show you something. Hold your spot here in Galatians and go to the book of Acts chapter 9 for just a moment. Acts chapter 9. Now this is what I mentioned a few moments ago that I was going to go to, and I want to... Acts chapter 9 in verses 1 through 22. Just listen to me for a moment before you start reading. In verses 1 through 22, Acts chapter 9 is all about the conversion of Paul, right? He gets saved. He gets born again. So by the time you reach verse 23, Paul is already beginning to go out and preach. Verse 23, now after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, which is ironic because Paul had just helped kill Stephen, one of the Christian preachers. In Acts chapter 8, it's all about Paul trying to kill the Christian preachers. In fact, if you look back in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, you see that? Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Now Saul was consenting to his death. Everybody see that? In Acts chapter 8? Now Saul, which would become Paul, right, was consenting to his death. Who's he? Stephen, one of the great preachers of the early church. Paul was the one who oversaw his death. Now Paul did not actually throw a rock. Paul gave the order. It's like the mafia. Who gave the order of the hit on Stephen? It would have been Paul. He was the guy. He gave the order. And he consented to his death. So he stood by and watched and oversaw the execution of Stephen, the assassination of Stephen. In fact, when you move ahead to Acts chapter 9, verse 1, Acts chapter 9, verse 1, then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. And according to Acts chapter 9 and verse 2, why was Paul going to talk to the high priest? Was he going for some worship? Maybe he was going to go have a Bible study. Maybe they were going to have a prayer meeting together. According to Acts chapter 9 and verse 2, why was Saul going to talk to the priest? Yeah, to get permission to go find more Christians and either kill them or throw them in jail. That is where he was headed when all this was happening. And that's how people knew him. So that's what's so remarkable when we move ahead all the way back to where we were just a few moments ago in Acts chapter 9 and verse 23. Acts chapter 9 and verse 23. Now, after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, Paul. It wasn't just a chapter earlier. He was the one doing the killing. And now they're trying to kill him. Things have changed radically. And they didn't change because of information. They changed because of transformation. Grace has transformed this man. In verse 24, but their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket. It wasn't just a chapter and a half earlier. He was the man. He was the leader among his contemporaries. He was one of the great leaders of the Jewish leadership. He was rising above everyone else. He was a 5-star recruit, and now he's escaping out of town in a basket. Oh, how things change. He was transformed. In verse 26, and when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, and they said, come on in, Saul. Boy, it's good to see you, right? Can you imagine headline in the paper? I don't know who the highest ranking ISIS officer is right now. I don't know who that is by name. But let's just take whoever that person is. If in the news tomorrow, where that officer, that highest ranking officer of ISIS, was converted to Christ, and he's coming to America to preach. Oh, no, he's not. The CIA, Homeland Security, I don't think so. How come? Yeah, like we're going to believe him, right? That was Paul. He showed up, verse 26, at the church in Jerusalem. You know what he was doing last time he was at the church in Jerusalem? The church in Jerusalem was having a worship service. Now you watch this. The church in Jerusalem was having a worship service. And he showed up and drug out one of their leaders into the street in front of the church and had him killed in front of his family, in front of his friends. We hear about these church shootings. We hear about these places where pastors or people in the church are shot in front of their own people. That was Paul. That's what he did. And now he's showing back up, coming forward. I want to join your church. Oh, no, you don't. Security, we're going to need you. Where's Travis? We want security here right now. What if a guy walked in here and shot one of the leadership, me or some of the leadership of this church, and a year later that same guy walks back in the door? That's what was happening. And see, sometimes just the ink on the page, we miss the human element going on here. And so again, verse 26, and when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. No kidding. They were afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple. Now, Barnabas will come alongside him and say, no, this guy's for real, right? He had to have a reference, to say the least. Now watch this. Paul would eventually join that church and preach there. There are things I think of, okay? There are just things I think of about that aren't really related to this study, but just for a moment, just humor me. What about Stephen's family? Were they still members of the church in Jerusalem? How could they handle the man who murdered their son? What if Stephen? I don't know. Okay, I don't know if Stephen's parents were members of that church. I don't know if he had cousins or brothers and sisters, but what if he did? Or at the very, very least, Stephen had close friends. Think about your closest friend in this church. If someone murdered them and then they showed up next year to join this church, how would you respond? Listen, there are some of you who refuse to forgive people because they snubbed you at Walmart. I should say some of us, at times Christians do. I don't know if any of you do. I hope you don't. But I've seen it. I've seen Christians refuse to allow grace to someone who did something legitimately wrong in the past. They don't like him coming back in the church. And what about Stephen's family? Here comes Paul. Well, I don't know what the response was. I do know this. He began to preach in that church in Jerusalem. Let me tell you something that God transforms. You ready? Some of you are going to say amen to this. God not only transforms our goals through grace, Christ not only transforms our directives through grace, but He transforms our reputation. Whew. Some of us are going, Pastor Johnny, that's good news. Because mine ain't so great. And some of you are saying, Pastor Johnny, I know what you're talking about. Because the reputation I used to have is not what I have. I got this one friend, I'm going to tell you something. In high school, he was basically a thug and a drug dealer. Guy got saved, began to preach the gospel, and went to his 20-year class reunion. He said, you know why I'm going back? Because when I walk in, they're going to be blown away because they've heard about what happened to me, and I'm going to get a chance to share the gospel. Listen, he had a group around him at the reunion. He had a group of kids trying to figure out what went on, and he was able to share the gospel with them. Changed his reputation. That's good news. That is good news. So grace transforms our goals. It changes from the inside and makes us look at things differently. Now, God may still take us into the job or the vocation or the calling we were called before we got saved. It's just that now our goals in that are different. Or He may change us completely. He transforms our goals. He transforms our directives. The things we're right around us we're pointed to, we're thinking about the things we want to do, the things we do day to day. And He transforms our reputation. God's grace transforms and changes every part of our lives and our calling. In the 1997 edition of the Christian magazine titled A New Man, there's a well-known author who shared a story in that magazine about a man named David McAllister. David McAllister, when the story was written in 1997, David McAllister was a blind, 77-year-old ex-convict. 22 years prior to that, 22 years, 55 years old, he kidnapped a 10-year-old boy named Chris Carrier, shot him, and left him for dead in the Florida Everglades. Although blinded in his left eye by the bullet, the young boy survived, who was 10 at the time. David McAllister, the convict, escaped. And for more than 2 decades, the case of the young man who had been kidnapped and shot went unsolved. That is, until one fall day when McAllister, his frail body bedridden in a Miami nursing home, distraught, he confessed to the crime. 22 years later, Carrier, the 10-year-old boy who is now 32, he heard about it. And after learning of the confession, he traveled to that nursing home to visit McAllister. You're going, yeah, I bet he did. Listen to what happened. But Chris Carrier did not go in anger or bitterness. He went to pray with his would-be murderer and share the good news of Jesus Christ that had transformed his own life. Chris Carrier lives transformed by grace. It changes everything. Now, next week, we're going to look at some more things. But for now, I'm just wondering how many of you connected with what I just said. How many of you said, Pastor Johnny, yeah, you're right, it has transformed my goals. Or maybe you're saying, Pastor Johnny, I don't know anything about what you're talking about. Maybe you're saying, Pastor Johnny, it's transformed my directives in my life. Or maybe you're saying, Pastor Johnny, I don't really know what you're talking about. Maybe you're saying, Pastor Johnny, you know, there were things I did when I was younger and I'm not proud of them. I look back and sometimes I'm even embarrassed. But God help, He's changed and is changing my reputation so that now people are even saying, are you really a Christian now? People that I knew back then, Pastor Johnny, He's changing the way people perceive me. He's changing the way people see me. He's changing my reputation. And folks, let me tell you how He's doing it. He's doing it from the inside out. He is transforming you. And so today I'm going to suggest that if you've never experienced any of these transformations at all, maybe it's time that you come and say, I want to know a little bit more about being truly born again. Because when you get born again, God transforms you. Maybe today you can come and just talk with someone about how to be born again. Maybe there's someone you're praying for. They claim to be Christians, but there's no evidence of transformation. Just by a show of hands, is there anybody out there that would say, Pastor, I know several people who by name they say they're Christians, but outwardly there's just no evidence of transformation. And I'm just really not sure that they've been transformed by grace. By a show of hands, anybody out there would say, Pastor, I know some folks. Listen, I'm not trying to pressure you, but maybe you want to come and just get at this altar and pray for them. Maybe you just want to come. Maybe me, Pastor Brian, will be down front too, and just say, I want to pray for by name. Listen, maybe it is that this is the church where you need to be. God's transformed you by grace, and it's time for you to connect in a fellowship where you can grow in that grace and you can serve the Lord. And today's that day. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to step down front, and I'm going to ask you to respond. Father, in Jesus' name, right now, help us to obey whatever you're saying, whatever you want us to do, we pray. Why don't you stand right where you are?